Romeo and Juliet for iHearShakespeare. Written and performed sometime between 1594 and 1597, Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet remains a staple in high school literature due in no small part to the nature of the protagonists' relationship. Indeed, the two star-crossed lovers have unfolded their dazzling trajectories to many students and sown the seeds for Shakespeare aficionados worldwide. The play is an ideal introduction to Shakespeare for young people since it holds a variety of attractive elements including comedy, tragedy, sword fighting, love, and parents who just don't understand. For Shakespeare, it is an early attempt in his career at tragedy, which has received mixed reviews throughout the centuries in terms of its design and subject matter. Rather than passing any kind of judgment one way or the other, it is more beneficial to examine the play in order to appreciate its compelling story, balanced structure, and almost universal accessibility. Now, let's begin with Act 1, Scene 1 of Romeo and Juliet. Romeo and Juliet begins with a group of actors who will, either as a single group or individually, speak the opening passage which is written in the structure of a sonnet. Within their prologue, we learn that there is an ancient grudge that exists between two families, which has never been resolved and only exacerbates the more important issues, and which can only be removed by the deaths of the lovers. We are thus asked to prepare for tragedy, but Scene 1 begins as a comedy, featuring two servants of the Capulet family, Samson and Gregory. For clarification, Juliet belongs to the Capulet family and Romeo to the Montagues. On a street in Verona, the two youngsters boast and brag about how tough they are and make crude references to their sexuality, which will typically go unnoticed by the novice reader. Samson and Gregory's dialogue is interrupted by Abraham and Balthazar, who are all too ready to fight. A minor skirmish breaks out when the level-headed Benvolio of the House of Montague calls for them to part, only to be interrupted by Tybalt of the House of Capulet, who manages to pick a fight with Benvolio. The noise in the street draws out the townspeople of Verona, including other Montagues and other Capulets. Chaos ensues until Prince Aeschylus enters, reprimands the boys for their behavior, and issues a warning that any other disturbance of this nature will be just cause for a death sentence. The general people clear the area, and Romeo's father and Benvolio talk about Romeo's peculiar disposition. Romeo, it seems, is in a melancholy mood due to his love for Rosaline. Benvolio appeals, "Be ruled by me, forget to think of her," and so convinces Romeo that there are fairer women than Rosaline whom he can view given the right opportunity. Scene 2 depicts Capulet praising the young nobleman Paris as a proper suitor to Juliet. Capulet instructs the young man to woo her at the masked ball tonight that the Capulet family will be holding. A servant is sent to invite certain guests to the ball, but since he can't read, must ask help from the nearest capable person. That person just so happens to be Romeo. Romeo reads the guest list, which includes Rosaline, and Benvolio suggests that they crash the party so that they may check out some other girls. Scene 3 takes us into the Capulet house, where Lady Capulet is trying to broach the subject of marriage with Juliet. This scene might have been a serious scene were it not for the bumbling nurse, who can't seem to take a hint that she should leave. Indeed, the scene is very comical due to the nurse's chatty and nosy nature. In due course, Lady Capulet informs Juliet that Paris is interested in marriage. Juliet replies rather coldly, "I'll look to like, if looking liking move, but no more deep will I endart mine eye than your consent gives strength to make it fly." In Scene 4, we have moved directly to the ball where, just outside, Romeo, Mercutio, Benvolio, and other party crashers intend to sneak into the ball. Before they enter, Mercutio teases Romeo for not being more excited about what they are doing. Mercutio proves himself an eloquent and provocative speaker full of lusty innuendo and dreamy phrases. Scene 5 takes us into the ball where Capulet is officially beginning the evening's festivities by offering a toast and calling for music. It is here that Romeo first sees Juliet, and within only a few lines, Tybalt catches sight of Romeo. Tybalt is about to accost Romeo when Tybalt is stopped by his father, who warns that he will not be embarrassed on this night with so many guests around. Free to flirt with Juliet within the confines of the Capulet party, Romeo speaks with Juliet and even manages a kiss. The nurse pulls Juliet away, and the scene concludes with Romeo and Juliet realizing that they are of opposing households. Here concludes Act 1 of Romeo and Juliet for I Hear Shakespeare. A second choral prologue, again in sonnet structure, precedes Scene 1 of Act 2. In it, we hear the chorus reiterate the love between Juliet and Romeo as worthy, but contrary to what their families would wish. Scene 1 depicts Romeo separating from his earlier companions in order to risk a chance meeting with Juliet. By Scene 2, Juliet appears at her balcony window as Romeo exclaims, "But soft, what light through yonder window breaks?" And the two perform what is perhaps the most famous love scene in all theater. Throughout the play, there are references to light and dark, day and night, sun and moon, which, depending upon the context and who is speaking, lend greater meaning to what is being said. There are other contrasting elements and ideas in the play as well, and even an inversion in the overall tone of the play after Mercutio is killed from comedy to tragedy. Shakespeare also uses this technique cleverly by inverting the lovers' names within the confines of the actual script, as he entitles the play Romeo and Juliet and ends the play with the line, "For never was a story of more woe than this of Juliet and her Romeo." By the end of Act 2, Scene 2, Romeo and Juliet have made plans to marry. In Scene 3, we are introduced to Friar Lawrence. Within his first soliloquy, we gather that he is learned in the ways of horticulture and foreshadows the means with which Romeo will kill himself. To make the point of foreshadowing more direct, who should enter but none other than Romeo himself? The two have a brief conversation about Romeo's former infatuation with Rosaline before discussing Romeo's greater interest in Capulet's daughter, Juliet. In hopes of uniting the houses of Montague and Capulet, the friar agrees to marry Romeo and Juliet. Scene 4 brings us back to Mercutio and Benvolio, who are still searching for Romeo. Romeo at last appears, and Mercutio teases him about staying out all night with Juliet. Being in good spirits, Romeo returns the jokes, and the sexual innuendo couldn't be more obvious. The nurse and Peter, who acts as a sort of servant to the nurse, soon join the scene. Mercutio and Benvolio make fun of the nurse's physical shape and note that her dress appears like a ship on the horizon. She's so big. Romeo instructs the nurse to send word back to Juliet that they will meet in secret to be married. Scene 5 shows Juliet anxiously awaiting the nurse's return and her news. After a very comical scene, Juliet finally learns that she is to meet Romeo at Friar Lawrence's cell. Scene 6 begins with Friar Lawrence preparing Romeo for the secret marriage, uttering an ironic blessing. "So smile the heavens upon this holy act, that after hours with sorrow chide us not." Here, Shakespeare is referencing not only what Friar Lawrence has just said and done, but also the act that has just been performed before the audience, and asked us to not be sorrowful afterwards. The two are next joined by Juliet, and then they all exit to the church. Here concludes Act 2 of Romeo and Juliet for I Hear Shakespeare. Act 3 begins with Mercutio and Benvolio loitering in a public place and complaining about the heat. Benvolio is certain that there will be a brawl if they do not go someplace else. Not before long, Tybalt and his followers enter, and the brawl that Benvolio feared begins to brew. Newly married to Tybalt's cousin, Romeo enters and appears determined to be friendly to Tybalt. Disgusted by Romeo's submissive words and behavior, Mercutio draws his sword, ready to fight on behalf of Romeo. During the fight that inevitably ensues, Mercutio is held back by Romeo and, because of Romeo's interference, is mortally wounded by Tybalt. Benvolio carries off Mercutio, but soon returns with the news that Mercutio is dead. As I stated earlier, this is the turning point in the tone of the play from comedy to tragedy. In a fury, Romeo draws his sword and slays Tybalt. Once again, the citizens, including the Capulet and Montague families, and Prince Aeschylus appear and demand an explanation. Benvolio recounts the events, and the prince decides that, in light of how it all happened, Romeo will not be executed, but he will be banished from Verona. The word banished in the play Romeo and Juliet is pronounced banished. Scene 2 finds Juliet alone, wishing the night would come more quickly. In an evocative soliloquy, Juliet prepares herself to lose her virginity to Romeo, but is interrupted by the nurse, who brings news that Tybalt is slain by Romeo's hand, and further, that Romeo is banished. Juliet's reply is filled with contradictory images. For example, she says, "O serpent heart, hid with a flowering face, did ever dragon keep so fair a cave? Beautiful tyrant, fiend angelical, dove-feathered raven, wolvish ravening lamb, and a damned saint, an honorable villain." As I mentioned before, Shakespeare heightens the tension by the use of contrasting elements and ideas. Scene 3 finds Romeo taking refuge in Friar Lawrence's cell. Romeo has yet to learn that he is banished. When Friar Lawrence informs Romeo of the prince's decree, Romeo says that he'd rather death than banishment. The nurse next comes knocking at the friar's door, bringing news of Juliet's similar woeful condition. The friar skillfully calms both the nurse and Romeo by, as it were, looking on the bright side of the situation and assuring them that he will devise a plan to bring Romeo and Juliet together. The first part of the plan includes sending Romeo to Mantua while Friar Lawrence begs pardon from the prince. His hope restored, Romeo sets off for Juliet's chamber. A brief scene 4 takes us into the sober company of Juliet's father and mother, who are planning Juliet and Paris's wedding with Paris. Scene 5 depicts Romeo and Juliet after they've consummated their marriage. As the day grows brighter, their spirits grow dimmer. The mood turns very dark when Juliet predicts, "O God, I have an ill-divining soul. Methinks I see thee, now thou art below as one dead in the bottom of a tomb. Either my eyesight fails, or thou look'st pale." To which Romeo replies, "And trust me, love, in my eye so do you. Dry sorrow drinks our blood." Romeo exits, and Juliet is left alone to contend with her family. Lady Capulet enters and mistakes Juliet's mood for being still upset over Tybalt's death. Juliet responds, taking care to be honest to her feelings, but not give away too much to her mother. At what seems to be Juliet's suggestion, Lady Capulet says that they will have vengeance served upon Romeo by hiring an assassin to go to Mantua and give him such an unaccustomed dram that will be sure to kill him. In an effort to change the subject and make Juliet feel better, Lady Capulet informs Juliet that she will be marrying Paris. Juliet adamantly refuses the arrangement and bids her mother to tell her father she said as much. The nurse and Capulet enter and interrupt Lady Capulet and Juliet. Capulet learns of Juliet's reaction and decision, becomes furious, and, in the presence of Lady Capulet and the nurse, scolds Juliet harshly, then takes his exit. Juliet begs for her mother's support and compassion, but Lady Capulet is too angry herself. In an effort to comfort Juliet and appease her parents, the nurse suggests that Juliet just marry Paris and forget about Romeo. Upon confirmation that the nurse is speaking from her heart, Juliet resolves nevermore to trust her. She next prepares to meet Friar Lawrence in the hopes of devising a plan to reunite with Romeo. "If all else fail," she declares, "myself have power to die." Here concludes Act 3 of Romeo and Juliet for iHearShakespeare. Act 4, Scene 1 begins with Friar Lawrence in his cell discussing with Paris the upcoming arranged marriage. Juliet appears after a few lines and engages in a brief and curt dialogue with Paris that is just as enigmatic as in her earlier scene with Lady Capulet. Paris exits and Juliet despairs in her predicament. When she exclaims, "I long to die," Friar Lawrence conjures a plan that, if properly executed, will thwart her arranged marriage with Paris. Friar Lawrence suggests, "If, rather than to marry County Paris, thou hast the strength of will to slay thyself, then is it likely thou wilt undertake a thing like death to chide away this shame, that copest with death himself to scape from it. and if thou darest, I'll give thee remedy. Juliet expresses her resolve to do whatever it takes to avoid the marriage her parents have arranged. Friar Lawrence explains that she must drink a kind of concoction from a vial that will cause her to appear like death and then awake as from a pleasant sleep, at which time Friar Lawrence will help Romeo escort her to Mantua. Scene 2 shows Capulet preparing for the upcoming wedding of his daughter. Juliet enters and pretends to have consented to her father's wishes, to which he responds, "My heart is wondrous light, since this same wayward girl is so reclaimed." Scene 3 depicts Lady Capulet and the nurse seeing Juliet to her bed. Then they exit, leaving her alone to think over the plan she has learned from Friar Lawrence. She ruminates over the possibility of waking from after taking the potion in the midst of dead bodies. With final resolve, she takes the potion, crying, "Romeo, I come, this do I drink to thee." Scene 4 shows Capulet making final preparations for the wedding feast. The light-hearted tone of the scene is, of course, in direct opposition to what will soon be discovered. Scene 5 begins with the nurse entering Juliet's bedchamber to wake her for her happy day. Of course, she finds Juliet, who appears to be dead, and cries out for Capulet and Lady Capulet. Accompanied by Paris, Friar Lawrence enters, knowing what to expect, but remembering to act surprised. Friar Lawrence manages to calm everyone by reminding them all that Juliet is now in heaven. He continues his monologue, explaining that they should all now prepare to take Juliet to the graveyard. Everyone exits except for Peter and the musicians, who conclude the scene in a rather comical fashion. Here concludes Act 4 of Romeo and Juliet for iHearShakespeare. Scene 1 of Act 5 begins with Romeo recanting a dream he had, which includes Juliet finding him dead, but brought him back to life with her kisses. Romeo's servant Balthazar enters, bringing false news that Juliet is dead. Romeo orders Balthazar to get some horses so that he may ride back to Verona. Romeo further contemplates a plan that includes buying poison from an apothecary, a shady-looking character who promptly makes his entrance. Romeo buys poison from the apothecary, then exits. In Scene 2, we meet Friar John, who has been working with Friar Lawrence. Friar John explains that he was unable to deliver any message to Romeo in Mantua because he, Friar John, was held up in a house by town officials since they feared the spread of the plague. In a panic, Friar Lawrence calls for a crowbar and then explains how he must go to Juliet's tomb in order to free her. In Scene 3, the action moves to the graveyard where Paris is placing flowers on Juliet's grave. Paris is warned with a whistle by his page that someone is coming and so hides himself. Romeo enters with Balthazar. Romeo then orders Balthazar to deliver a letter to his father, and although Balthazar promised he would leave Romeo alone, Balthazar hides to one side while Romeo opens Juliet's tomb. Paris now steps from his hiding place and, intending to act honorably toward the house of the Capulets, orders Romeo to leave Juliet's tomb in peace. Not knowing who Paris is, Romeo issues his own warning to be left alone. The two draw their swords and Paris is slain. Romeo takes a moment to learn the identity of his attacker and, in an effort to honor Paris, says, "I'll bury thee in a triumphant grave." Next, while speaking a lengthy meditation on death and love, Romeo kisses Juliet, then drinks the poison he bought from the apothecary in Mantua. Friar Lawrence enters and, with the help of Balthazar, comes to realize that Paris and Romeo are dead in the tomb of Juliet. As he is making this realization, Juliet wakes and asks for Romeo. Friar Lawrence hears someone coming and begs Juliet to leave the tomb quickly, but she will not leave Romeo. As the watchmen are coming to investigate the graveyard, Juliet quickly takes a dagger and kills herself. The chief watchman takes note of the bodies and sends some others to wake the Capulets, the Montagues, and the prince. Balthazar and Friar Lawrence are brought from their hiding places by other watchmen as the prince, the Capulets, and the Montagues enter. Juliet's parents express their grief, and Montague explains how Romeo's mother died of heartbreak due to her son's exile. At the request of the prince, Friar Lawrence recounts how everything came about. Friar Lawrence begins by revealing that he married Romeo and Juliet in secret and recounts the action as it unfolded in the graveyard. In conclusion, the prince places the blame on the heads of the Capulet and Montague families, saying, "Capulet, Montague, see what a scourge is laid upon your hate, that heaven finds means to kill your joys with love. And I, for winking at your discords, too have lost a brace of kinsmen. All are punished." Capulet and Montague respond by taking hands and pledging peace. Montague promises to raise a statue of Juliet in town made of pure gold. Capulet will likewise erect a statue of Romeo just as splendid. The prince speaks the last words, not only to the actors on stage, but to the audience as well. He says, "A glooming peace this morning with it brings. The sun for sorrow will not show his head. Go hence, to have more talk of these sad things. Some shall be pardoned, and some punished. For never was a story of more woe than this of Juliet and her Romeo." Here concludes Act 5 of Romeo and Juliet for I Hear Shakespeare.